Right, today we're going to show you how to design a surgical guide with 3Shape Implant Studio from beginning to end. So we're going to click on this Implant Studio icon to launch the program. And we'll hit on Default User. So from here you're going to want to click on New Patient, and you'll type in your patient's first and last name. So I'll put 3Shape Training for our demo, and we're going to hit New Case. So all this information is inputted correctly, so we hit Next. And the demo that we're going to show you is how to design a implant surgical guide for tooth number 3. So we'll hit tooth number 3, and we're going to perform a virtual wax up. So we want to click on this Implant Studio Virtual Crown. And then we're also going to hit Implant Planning and make sure our Tooth Supported button is selected. And you want to make sure that both of these check marks are selected for Implant Planning and the surgical guide. So if you rotate the image, you can see that we both have an implant and the surgical guide in our case setup. So we can then move on to the next phase, which is to import our scans. So there's the upper and lower surface scans, which is the intraoral scans of the patient's mouth, and also we need a cone beam scan of the patient's head. So we'll start with the upper surface scan, and under the Z drive is labeled 3D Digital Dentistry. You want to access that drive and hit the 3Shape folder. And our patient's intraoral scans are listed under Dental Systems. So click there, and then you'll scroll through to find your patient's name. And our demo, we have 3Shape Training, tooth number 3, and then you're going to go in the Scans folder. So the first scan that they want is the upper scan, so we're going to click on the upper folder, and both of these are the same files, so I usually just pick the raw preparation scan. So that'll load the intraoral scan of the patient's maxillary arch. And we'll do the same for the lower, so we can step up and go to the lower folder and do the same thing. Alright, the last piece of the puzzle is this head CT scan. So I'm going to go back to the 3Shape folder, and under Implant Studio DICOMs, this is where our CBCT information is. So we'll double click there, and again scroll through until you find your patient's CBCT scan. So when you find your patient's folder, it'll have a selection of these slices, and you can just pick the first slice there, and it'll load the remaining slices for you. So hit select to move on. And now this is imported, so we can hit next to advance onto the tooth design portion. So we want to do a virtual wax up of tooth number 3, and we want to place this tooth in sort of the approximate position. So if you right click, you can rotate the arch around. If you hit Alt and right click, it'll allow you to pan. And then if you scroll with your mouse scroll button, you can zoom in and out. So basically you want to orient the cast such that you can place the tooth in sort of its approximate position. So when you're pretty happy with the setup, you can left click there. And now we can kind of sculpt the tooth into its appropriate contours. So they have red and green circles that you can use to scale and rotate the tooth. So the green button here will allow you to scale it to the right dimensions. So I'm using the adjacent teeth just as a guide for my buccal, lingual, and our mesial distal width. And then you can take the red buttons and rotate them to the appropriate kind of contours. So this looks a little high in occlusion, so we'll drop this down. And then from this view, what I'm looking for is, do the cusp tips kind of line up? So what you can do is take these red dots and kind of just lean the cuss tips in, or you can even rotate the whole thing. So you can pull this back just a bit and rotate around. And I'll sight down this angle here and look at our cuss tips here. So once you got things pretty well in line, the important part is the central groove, because we want to visualize our implant will exit out of this proposed tooth wax up. So this wax up isn't going to be the actual final contour of our implant crown. That'll be fabricated much down the line. But this gives us an idea of where our ideal implant placement is going to be. So you want this to be about 90% of what the actual tooth would look like. If you wanted to check the occlusion, you can hit A, or you can go to this scroll icon here to turn it on and off or change the various translucencies. So this applies for all the other items that you have in our plan. So you just want to make sure that the occlusion is sort of within reason, that you're not in a huge crossbite or anything like that. So I think this tooth position is fairly appropriate, and we can now move on to our next phase. So we'll hit next. Okay, so this is the cropping section of the workflow, and here you'll see the memory required, and we can crop out some of the unnecessary data to cut down on the memory. So using these scroll buttons, you can kind of scroll through and see where your maxillary teeth are, and you just want to make sure that they're not cut off. So you can decrease these boxes, and we can get down to a more manageable file size. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We'll scroll through once again and make sure that none of the maxillary teeth are cut off. Right, this next section is our panoramic curve, and what we want to do is raise this blue button up to the area that you can see the ridge and where all the bone is, and essentially you just want to draw a curve that goes down the center of the ridge. And you can use the teeth sort of as your guide as well, and when you get to the end you can double click to close that off. So if you were to hold down Control and scroll through your mouse, you can see how this line here corresponds to this orthogonal view, and the tan line here corresponds to this tangential view. And you can see the various slices as you traverse down the curve that you had previously drawn. So that looks good, and we'll advance. So this is a scan alignment step, and the first thing you want to do is move these casts so that they're approximately in the same orientation, both in size and position. So again, it's Alt and right click to pan. You can zoom with the scrolling your mouse. So that looks about right. When you got things pretty much lined up, you can hit the lock view, so that any movement that you do to one screen will be reflected in the other. So what we want to do is find real defined anatomical kind of markers. So usually a cuss tip is an easy one. So I'll choose this distal buccal cuss tip, and you want to click the corresponding sites on the corresponding scan. So here I'm going to choose the distal line angle of tooth number 9, and I'll click the same area on the intraoral scan. And you want your 3 points to be as spread out as possible. So I'll pick this cuss tip and click there. So before I click there, you can take a look at this screen here, and as I click the button, you'll see the two images merge together. So if you want to check how well it lines up, you can hit this distance show difference map. And what this does, it lets you know if you're within this green zone. It'll show you that they're merged together to within 25 microns. If, let's say, you're off, you can always go back and then alter your points so that they line up a little bit better. Another way to confirm is through this manual alignment window, and then you can kind of rotate or kind of scan through the teeth, and you can see this tan outline is our intraoral scan, and you can see how it's overlaid against the CBCT data. So you want to make sure that the lines kind of overlap with the teeth. So to me that looks like it's pretty appropriately overlapped. So if you're happy with the way they're overlapped, then you can hit this confirm alignment button, and this will allow you to move on to our implant planning stage. So we're going to plan the implant on tooth number 3. So in this window you can see this plus button, and this means to add the implant, and it'll pull up this window where you can select your differing implant by manufacturer. So the two that we have at the school are Zimmer and Straumann, and if you click on one for Zimmer, we usually use the tapered screw vent MTX surface. So if you click here, it'll have a drop down of your differing diameters as well as the implant lengths. For this situation, let's just choose Straumann. And Straumann, we generally use in our clinic, we'll use the bone level rock solid implant. So again, they have different diameters and different lengths. So for the sake of our exercise, let's just arbitrarily pick a 4.1 by 10 implant. So when you select that, it'll automatically place the implant in sort of the position that you had planned your tooth. So you have your different views that you can look through, and if you wanted to take a larger look at the window, you can hit the maximize button, and again you can use your mouse to scroll in and out and zoom in and out. So as you can see, this is our maxillary sinus, and our implant is a little bit too long. So two ways you can change the implant length. You can go back to this window and go to an 8mm. When you click that, it'll shorten the implant. The other way to do it is to hold on to this green circle, and then you can extend the implant lengths to whatever you want, or you can decrease it. So we probably need an 8mm implant for this amount of space to avoid any sinus lifting. You can also move the implant by just simply clicking and dragging it to the position that you want, and then the red circle, that'll change the angulation. Okay. So what you see here, this is the body of the implant, and this line that surrounds it is a custom safety zone. Right now the safety zone is set to 1.5mm in the radial direction, meaning from this point to this point is 1.5 millimeters, and then the apical distance is from here to this point here. So when we're planning the implants, we want the implant to be surrounded by bone circumferentially, and the minimum requirement for our buccal and lingual plate is 1 millimeter of bone width here. So if you're looking at it from tooth to implant, in that distance we want 1.5 millimeters minimum distance between the tooth and the implant. So this is where the safety zone comes in handy, where if you get too close to a certain tooth, it's an easy way to visualize that we're violating this 1.5 millimeter guideline. And from implant to implant, the dimension that we're shooting for is at least 3 millimeters between the two implants. Okay, so one of the goals is to obviously have the implant embedded in the bone, meeting our minimum kind of requirements for bone on each side. The other thing we'd like to do too is to have the screw channel of the implant exit out of the central groove of the tooth. That would allow us to keep this restoration as a screw retain restoration, and that allows for retrievability and minimizes or eliminates the chance of any cement or peri-implantitis due to cement cleanup. So again, you'll kind of rotate and kind of position the implant so that we can try to get it into those ideal parameters. So again, you ideally would want the implant through the central groove and centered mesial distally. And then 2, you want to make sure that you have a minimum amount of bone around the implant. So one way in which you can check this is if you hold down the control button and then you scroll with the mouse, you can see that we're rotating around the implant. So if you pay attention to these boxes here, there's a purple and sort of an aqua color. These correspond with these 2 windows. And as I'm scrolling through while holding down control, I'm rotating and spinning around the implant to look at all my bone levels. And you can see at the top the angle at which we're at. That will change as you scroll through. If you want to take a look at a different view, what you can do is disable this implant align plane. So when you do that and then you hold the control button down while you're scrolling through, pay attention to see these little lines and how they interact as you scroll through. So the previously defined panoramic curve is the path in which these cross sections are being taken from. So you can take a look from distal to mesial and kind of slice through that way and see if you got enough bone surrounding your implant. Or you can hit on the enable implant align plane and then just spin around it. Okay? And in both those views you can change your positioning at kind of any point, either rotating or moving it around. So you just kind of want to visualize and kind of do a final check in this 3D view. You can turn on this cylinder to see the implant position and where it's kind of coming out of. So if you wanted to, you can rotate the implant so it's a little bit more centered. And here we can see just a little of the remnants of the mandibular teeth. So the way that this workflow goes is you can click on any one of these boxes that you've previously filled out, and then you can change the parameters in them, and then you can jump back to where you had kind of left off. So for example, if we wanted to cut off this tooth just so that we can see and not have this in the way, we can jump back to the cropping window. We can move this up so it avoids that tooth, and then we can jump forward to the implant planning, and then that cuts off that little artifact there. Okay? So if you're happy with the positioning of the implant, and that looks pretty good to me, centered mesial-distally and buccolingually, then we can go to the surgical guide planning portion. The first thing you want to do is set the axis or the insertion direction. So I just take a look at the path in which the guide should be seated, and you should orient it so that essentially you're looking at the top of the teeth, and then you'll see this arrow here change when I push this from view button. Okay, so this establishes our path of insertion, and you can see these dark areas are the undercuts, and it'll virtually block it out when they design our guide. So this shows where height of contour is. The other thing you want to do is, this is our metal sleeve that helps direct the surgeon and their drill what the proper angulation is. You want to raise this so that it's not interfering with the soft tissue. So you can see there's a tissue here, and at this level we're off of the tissue, so that's good. And at this point we want to start adding patches. So basically we want to start designing where our surgical guide is going to sit on. So I'm going to turn off this sleeve here just so it's easier to see. But we're going to click this add patch button, and then we're just essentially going to draw around this tooth. So to complete the circle, you'll double click here, and any kind of rough areas you can smooth out. So the computer generally does not like any real sharp areas or sharp transitions, so you want to smooth it out. So to give you a little preview of what that would look like, we'll hit the preview button, and you can see that we have part of our guide kind of designed. Okay, we're going to do the same with the other teeth now. So turn off the sleeve so it's a little easier to see. And then we're going to add our second patch. So start in the soft tissue. And then generally I'll trace along the height of contour here. So I'll just quickly click through, and I'll go back and smooth out any areas. So I'll pick this molar as our endpoint, and we'll travel back until we complete our loop. So we'll complete the loop there. Okay, so as you can see, there's some real sharp areas and also some areas where the guide is a little bit thin through these interproximal regions. Okay, so I'm going to go back and just smooth out some of these areas. Okay, so once we're satisfied with this line here, then we can preview it. Alright, so now this is designed. One of the things that we can do to help the surgeons figure out if this guide is seated on the teeth is we can add these little viewing windows. So we hit bars and windows, and we go down a viewing window, and we'll select an area in between two teeth, and again you can rotate or make these smaller or larger. And if we hit preview, then it'll show what I'm talking about here, where now when we seat the guide we can look through these little viewing windows to make sure that it's seated down onto the teeth all the way. So I like to put about 3 of these, one on the opposite side and then another adjacent to the edentulous space. So we'll pick this area here, we'll put a little window. Let's rotate that just a bit. And we'll put our third one on tooth number 2 here. Okay, so we can hit preview and see what that looks like. Okay, so we have our 3 viewing windows. And the last thing we can do is put the patient's name onto the surgical guide. So we'll hit ID tag. We'll put the patient's name. You can put it right there. Okay, so if you're happy with the way that this surgical guide looks, then it's ready to be printed out. One of the areas that you do want to pay attention to is these connector areas, and you see how these areas can be a little bit thin. So if you go back, you can redraw your line and make that a little bit wider, and that'll help prevent it from kind of fracturing or breaking at that area. Another thing you can do is you can add these little supporting bars that'll add a little bit extra strength to these thinner areas. So you can click on bars and windows, and you can add a support bar, and then you can add these bars to help make this area a little bit thicker. Okay, so now we can preview what that would look like. So you can see we've added a little bit of bulk in that area so it's not so prone to fracture. Okay, so if you like the way everything's designed, you can hit next, and we can finish our design. You're going to click the Approve Planning and Approve Surgical Guide. Once you click these buttons, you won't be able to go back and edit any of the implant position. All you can do is view where the implants are placed. So double check that you have everything how you that you're satisfied with your design of your implant surgical guide as well as your implant placement. So when you're ready, you can hit next, and this will generate an output of the STL file that we need to 3D print. So design is completed and saved. You can open the folder, and there's a couple PDF files that you're going to need to print out. So one is of the drilling protocol, and this lets the surgeon know what size drill to use and what length, and also a surgical report that has the implant information of implant length and diameter, etc., as well as cross sections of your CBCT scan with the implant and tooth in place, so they can help visualize the surgery a little better. And this is the important file. This is the STL file that has the surgical guide on it. This needs to be put on a thumb drive and given to Awatuki Dental, where they will 3D print the file. You'll go to DDX, and then you're going to go to Procedure and find Surgical Guide. Well, you'll type in that you want them to 3D print the surgical guide. So that needs to be printed and given to the lab. And finally, when we go to 3Shape Surgical Guides, this is where the output of the file goes. You're going to go ahead and change this to the patient's name. So for this demo, we're going to go 3Shape Training. Okay. So that is how you fabricate a surgical guide with the Trios Implant Studio software from beginning to end.